When I was a new nurse in the mother baby world about 20 years or so ago, I remember a dear lactation consultant that I worked with showing me a graph about the amount of time that it takes to breastfeed versus bottle feed. And even though I've never seen it anywhere else exactly like what she showed me, it has never left my memory because it just made it all make sense. Over the years since then, I've heard lots of bad information that is really misleading when it comes to how you feed your baby and how much time it takes. So I want to take some time today to look at the reality of how long it takes to feed your baby each way. This is good information for you to take into account when it comes to making the final decision for how you're going to feed your baby as you move into that newborn period. Let's go talk about it. Are you a Christian woman yearning for a beautiful, joyful pregnancy and birth with a focus on God, not medical tests? Are you worried the birth you want isn't possible and you're tired of being treated like an accident waiting to happen? Hey mama, I'm Lori, host of Your Birth God's Way. I'm a certified nurse-midwife now, but I wasn't always. After working for nearly 20 years in the broken maternity system, I too was in your shoes wondering how I could have the birth I wanted and that I felt God meant for me to have. I found a secret that has actually been known since the beginning of time. God's way is the best way. Spoiler alert, God made us and our babies, and He knows us best. He designed us perfectly for pregnancy, birth, and nourishing our babies after birth, if we work with His design and not against it. In this podcast, you'll learn how to be healthy and have joy during this time of life that will be over before you know it. So if you're ready to reclaim your birth and your babies for His glory, go turn on a few episodes of Bluey for that little one on your hip so you can put the focus back on you for a few minutes with me. Review time. Today's review is from, it looks like Mountain Granny. Love the name. You know how much I love these iTunes, iPhone screen names or whatever. I think you guys enter those in and you never look at them again. That's what I did. It's probably what you did too. At any rate, title says, tells it like it is. Love Lori's perspective as a former hospital practitioner whose eyes were open to how birth was being manipulated in the system. Her podcast shares what she now knows. Pregnancy and birth were beautifully designed by our all-knowing, all-loving Creator, and we can fully trust in His ways and His plans for our own journeys. I love that. That is beautifully written, beautifully expressed, and I just appreciate the encouragement so much because my eyes really were opened, and I hope that some of you are having your eyes opened as well, because what we've been told about a whole lot of things is really not true. And what we're going to talk about today is one of those things. If you are one of the people who have not left me a review yet, would you, before we move on into the episode, just hit pause real quick, head over to Apple Podcasts on your phone, your iPad, your Mac, your friend's Mac, your friend's iPhone, whatever, if you don't have an Apple product, and leave me a quick 5-star written review. It helps me so much. It encourages me so much, and it helps me find other moms like you who need the same information that you're learning from. So go do that for me real quick, hop back over, and we'll get started. All right, so when I was working in the hospital, this has been a while back, I heard a lot of people say things like, breastfeeding just takes too long, or I don't have the time to breastfeed. And I remember thinking, I don't think that's really right, but I couldn't really ever express it. I was too new. I didn't really understand it all. I hadn't breastfed any babies myself at that point in time. And so I kind of went with it because I didn't know any better. Also heard many stories of parents not getting enough sleep. Okay, so we've got these two different stories. The story of breastfeeding takes too long, but then parents are exhausted in this newborn period. And to me, something never quite added up right. These parents who were talking about not getting enough sleep, also talking about babies who had upset tummies, and they just never really connected the dots. They never put it all together. This is likely because they didn't get the full story and they made their decisions for how to feed their baby based on partial information. I hate seeing moms make decisions based on partial information, and I don't remember seeing much out there as I've been reading through various things over the years about how long feeding takes for various types of for feeding your babies. Sorry, that wasn't exactly clear. Hope that made sense. So what I thought was that today we needed to address this because I want to make it clear how long these types of feeding take, whether it be breastfeeding, formula feeding with a bottle or pumping and bottle feeding the breast milk that you express, how long each of these things takes so that you can kind of weigh that into your decision and understand that sometimes our choices for how we're going to feed our baby directly play into these stories of being exhausted, not getting enough sleep, and babies with upset tummies, because those things, believe it or not, all kind of go together. And those of you listening to this podcast, you already know that God designed us to breastfeed. If you're listening, most likely you're a Christian, most likely you believe in the Lord and you believe in His perfect design. We've talked about that time and time and time again. This is not news to you. And at the same time, the world has told you, you might not be able to do this. This might be too hard for you. It might be too difficult. It might hurt. All these different things that have planted the seeds of doubt in the old noggin up here. And so now you're thinking, well, I want to breastfeed if, and you start to consider that maybe there are other ways that might be viable options. Beyond all of that, the world has sexualized our breasts in a way that has caused us to forget a lot of times that that's what they're there for. They're there to nourish our babies. Do our husbands enjoy them? Yeah. Does the world put them on TV for the whole world to look at? Yeah. But that's not what they're for. They are there to nourish our babies. And the majority of women can breastfeed when properly supported and educated. It's kind of like giving birth naturally these days. Most people think they can't do it, but in reality, most women can do it when they are properly supported and properly educated to remove all that indoctrination that has told you you can't do it. So that's what we're going to work on today. We're going to work on getting those things out of your head and reminding you that this is the way God made it and that you can do this and that it's actually the best choice when lined up against these other two ways of feeding. Now, I guess that was a spoil. I should have given you a spoiler alert. I just gave you the answer, but we're going to go through the why and proving this all to you as well. First thing we're going to talk about is formula feeding. So formula feeding here, we're going to assume that you're buying it in a powder form because usually, unless you're in the hospital, you're buying it in powder form and you're mixing it with water to create your bottle that you're going to give to your baby. Okay. So the time warming the water and the time mixing the formula, it kind of depends on how you warm the water. There's a lot of variables here. So I'm just kind of putting some guesstimates on the times here. But from warming the water to getting it poured, to getting the formula mixed, shaken, and delivered to the baby, I estimate takes maybe 15 minutes or so. Granted, I have never formula fed my own babies. And I've certainly never put a timer on anyone. It may be a little bit less for some, but somewhere maybe 10, 15 minutes is probably what it's taking for most people to get everything together, get the bottle put together, get the formula mixed, get the water warmed, all these things. Okay, so 15 minutes there. To feed the baby, especially in those early days, and burp the baby is going to take somewhere around 15 to 30 minutes. Just like with breastfeeding that we're going to talk about in a little while, the longer you go on into life, the older the baby gets, they get a little bit better at transferring the milk. Maybe it doesn't take quite as long. But in general, giving a baby a bottle is going to take the same amount of time across the board. So somewhere around 15 to maybe 30 minutes, depending on the baby, for the feeding and the burping. Then the cleanup time of cleaning up the bottles, washing them and all that stuff, maybe 10 to 15 minutes. Okay. So we've got 15 minutes, 15 to 30 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes. So somewhere around maybe 45 minutes that a feeding can take. And then if you multiply that by the low end of 8 feedings per day, that's 6 hours a day spent feeding. And that is around the clock. So all of those 6 hours, it's not like you can put them straight in the middle of your day and just get them all over with there, right? They are spread throughout your day. They're at midnight, they're at 3 a.m., they're at all the times of the night, even when you're trying to sleep. So when you are bottle feeding, formula feeding your baby, and your baby is hungry at midnight, you still have to warm the water, you still have to mix the bottle, and all those things require you getting up, waking your brain up to go do things, probably turning lights on to be able to see what you're doing. Then you're feeding and you're burping. And then if you decide to clean up while, like right after the feeding, while you're awake, these are all things that are causing you to get very much awake, maybe twice a night. Do you see where I'm going with this? This is part of the reason why bottle feeding moms tend to be exhausted. Keep in mind that we're not going to talk today about the nutrition side of things. We're not going to talk today about the different digestive elements that play into having a formula-fed baby. But suffice it to say, a lot of the tummy issues that are out there that also cause fussy babies that don't want to sleep, mixed in with mamas who are having to get up and fix these bottles in the middle of the night, all those things play into fussy baby, exhausted mama. Okay. I don't mean to paint this in such a negative view. It's just it's reality, because these are things where you're taking artificial elements, trying to make them into food to then give to your baby, and it takes time. It is not what is readily available at all times, as is the case with breastfeeding. Let's move on to pumping and bottle feeding, because some people will say that pumping and bottle feeding is the same as breastfeeding. And on some level, it kind of is. But in reality, there's a lot of information exchanged between the baby's mouth and maybe different things the baby has going on that your body then senses, maybe infections, maybe sicknesses the baby may have going on. Your body actually takes it in through this breastfeeding time and then starts to give your baby in return antibodies towards whatever's going on in his body or her body. And that's one of the cool things that you do lose in the pumping and bottle feeding. But pumping and bottle feeding, I don't want to completely knock it, because it is still getting your antibodies and the best nutrition to your baby. But let's look at the reality of the time, because pumping and bottle feeding is all of the time of breastfeeding plus all of the time of formula feeding. It is exhausting, because you've still got to, even though you're not warming water in this case, you're warming milk. Okay, so you got to warm the milk and get it ready in a bottle. That's 10 to 15 minutes if you're warming it correctly, which is usually in hot water and waiting. So 10 to 15 minutes of the preparation. Feeding and burping, as with formula feeding, is going to take 15 to 30 minutes or so. Clean up, again, 10 to 15 minutes, just like with formula feeding. Okay, that's the feeding element. So right at the same amount as formula feeding, that's 45 minutes or so per feeding. But each feeding, we're also having to pump. Okay, so between pumping, storing the milk, and cleaning up all of the things with the pump, that's another 30 minutes, maybe more, at least 8 times per day. Now, I'm saying 8 times just to have a nice even number, but in reality, newborn babies tend to eat even more than that, especially breastfed babies. So I say 8, it may be up to 12 times, okay? But we're going to estimate on the low end just to err on that side, so you don't say I'm just trying to make it sound bad, okay? So pumping, storing, and cleanup, 30 minutes per session times 8 sessions per day, even in the middle of the night, that's 4 hours. Okay, so we got the 6 hours from the feeding part, because remember, 45 minutes times 8 feedings was 6 hours, plus 4 hours for the pumping part. That's around 10 hours per day, around the clock, even when you're sleeping, even when you're away from home, all of these things. Okay, 10 hours a day. That's a lot. That is a whole lot. It's exhausting and it's very hard to maintain. And most moms don't keep up with this for very long because it's just too much time. Nobody has that many hours in the day to give. But then there's breastfeeding. And breastfeeding is often sold as being the most time intensive. On the front end, the very first maybe 2 weeks, that can be true sometimes. And here's why. A feeding in the first couple of weeks usually takes maybe 30 to 45 minutes. Okay, that sounds like a lot. So that's, getting up to an hour, maybe sometimes, times 8 to 12 times a day. That's up to 12 hours those first couple of weeks. So can it be more than bottle feeding or formula feeding or pumping in and bottle feeding? At the front end, yes. But here's the kicker. That decreases down to maybe 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes within a few weeks, because that baby learns how to latch. You don't have to spend so much time getting the baby latched on. He or she also gets much better at transferring milk, so it's a much quicker process. And so we go from 30 to 45 minutes, 8 to 12 times a day, which is 12 hours, down to 10 to 30 minutes per feed for 8 to 12 times a day, which is somewhere between an hour and a half to 6 hours. Okay? So either way you cut it, you are at or less than formula feeding. And I know this is hard to track when you're not seeing it written down. Maybe you're jotting down notes while we're talking. But that time with 6 hours on the upper end now, rather than 6 hours being all there is, you're only going to be 6 hours because you've always got to clean the bottles and you always got to warm up the bottle or the water and all these things. It's a big difference. And here's the biggest difference. Not just the number of hours per day you're spending feeding your child, but when the baby needs to eat in the middle of the night, you are not having to get up and go turn on the lights and get out the things and warm up the water and mix up the bottles or thaw the milk, warm it up, put it in a bottle. You're not having to do those things. Do you know what you do? Especially when you combine this with co-sleeping, which we've talked about in a different episode. You just roll over and latch the baby on, and then you doze while the baby's eating, because after a week or two, baby holds itself on. You really don't have to do much once you get it or her latched, and you can just doze, or you can look at her, or you can, do whatever else, read a book, look at your phone, whatever it might be. It doesn't involve you having to get up and get your brain fully awake to where you can't go back to sleep. And that's the beauty of it. That's what they don't tell you about. Is it more work in those first 2 weeks? Yes, it can be. I'm not trying to say that it's not. It can involve work if maybe you've had some speed bumps that have made it a little harder. Maybe, you had a medicated birth and baby's having trouble staying awake, or, maybe baby doesn't want to open its mouth big enough. There's different little issues that come up. I'm not denying that. But what I'm saying is, if you will spend those first 2 weeks and really put that time in and that dedication and really work on it in those first 2 weeks, it will pay off in dividends. The chart that I mentioned in the introduction, the way it looked, and I'm going to try to draw a mental picture for you. Remember, this is going to require you to go back to your high school brain of what a graph looks like, right? You've got the y-axis that goes up and down. You've got the x-axis that goes left to right. The x-axis is the amount of time in weeks. Okay, so, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever, going on out to however many weeks you want to put on it. The y-axis is how much time each feeding takes. Okay, so maybe goes up in 5-minute increments or something like that. The bottle feeding line starts at some level and it's just a flat line across. It never changes because the feeding still takes the same amount of time. The fixing the bottles takes the same amount of time. It all takes the same amount of time from now till whenever. We're not even getting into all the inconvenience of having to carry all that stuff everywhere you go to feed your baby. That's a whole different topic. Regardless, let me get back on top, get back focused. The line is a flat line all the way across. The breastfeeding line on that same chart, same axes and everything, starts out just a little bit, maybe, 10, 20 minutes higher than that flat line for the first couple of weeks. And then there is a slope down to a very low number, a very low flat line that then the rest of the way goes out flat. And when you see that, and I do wish there was a way for me to convey that in a picture over a podcast, but I just can't do it. That graphic, though, if you'll just listen to what I said, maybe sketch it out or sketch it out in your mind, that graphic tells you everything you need to know about the reality of how long it takes to do each type of feeding. Breastfeeding, while it is harder on those first 2 weeks, if you've never done it before and you have any kind of issues with it at all, if you will stick with it through those hard days, it will pay off so much more than you understand, because you will be rested and you will have a baby that doesn't have upset tummy issues, and everybody will just do better because it's how God designed us. And that's really the key. That's what we got to get back to, that this is how God designed babies to be fed. Our world has told us that, oh, it's okay if you don't breastfeed. And is it? Yes. Can your child survive? Of course. But are they going to do as well? I can't in good conscience tell you that they will, because nothing inside of me can say that something that a man made out of chemicals is ever going to be as good as what God made inside of our bodies. We have nourished our babies for 40 plus weeks solely from our bodies. Why is it that we think that once that baby is born, that somehow suddenly the kid would just, die if it wasn't for modern formula? That's not true. Our bodies can nourish our babies, and with the proper support and the proper education, they can do it with relative ease. There are lots of people out there as well who will help you if you're having trouble. And so I always encourage you to have a lactation consultant's number in your phone ready to go just in case you have issues, because I'm telling you, even the expense of paying a lactation consultant is going to be worth it in the long run, because formula is not cheap. It is expensive. And the money you will spend on a good lactation consultant to help you work through any feeding speed bumps you might hit is going to be far less than what it's going to cost you in formula over however long your baby is drinking that. And that's the reality of it. It is a money issue these days, right? Things cost money. Lactation consultants cost money, but they cost far less than that formula will cost you. And again, another little side issue to think about. Let's not even get into that. When we had the supply chain issues where people couldn't even find formula. What a helpless feeling to need that to nourish your baby, and it's no longer available. Whereas if you're breastfeeding, it's there, it's ready to go, it's at the perfect temperature with the perfect nutrition at any hour of the day, anywhere you are, with no equipment, no nothing. Am I painting a rosy picture around breastfeeding? Absolutely. Of course I am, because it's the best way. And when I hear people say fed is best, I know what the heart is behind that. I'm not knocking it. But I will say that there is no formula in any can anywhere that is ever going to match up to the perfect milk that changes as your baby grows, that progresses as your baby grows to give it exactly what it needs in protein, fat, carbs, all that stuff throughout the breastfeeding relationship. There is nothing in a can that's ever going to match what God made inside of us, period. And while it might take slightly more time in the beginning, when you're first learning, that persistence pays off. If you will spend those 2 weeks, as I said, I'm going to say it again. If you'll spend those first 2 weeks or so establishing that breastfeeding relationship and really working on it, your time later that you're going to spend feeding is going to drastically decrease. And the stress of having to carry stuff around to be able to feed your baby is all going to go away, because you'll always have it ready to go whenever you need it. You won't have to worry about taking the formula or the bottles or good water or anything else. You're not going to have to take any of that with you. You're not going to have to warm it up out in public trying to figure out how to have warm water. None of that stuff. You won't have to worry about pumping and all that brings, all the parts and the cooling the milk or freezing the milk and then later thawing it and warming it, all that stuff. You don't have to worry about any of that. The time commitment for formula feeding and pumping and bottle feeding never decreases. It's always the same for the duration of the time that you are choosing to do those things before the baby grows to the point that it doesn't need those things anymore. But breastfeeding gets easier and easier. Not to mention the nutrition changes that I just told you about, not to mention all these things that are perfectly in perfect proportions in breast milk that you lose when you don't breastfeed. And that even goes with pumping, because there's some thought that, I mentioned earlier about the exchange of information between the baby and the mom. I don't know how well your body can sense what your baby needs at this particular level of development without that direct latch on relationship. Now, is pumping and bottle feeding better than formula feeding? Yes, I will take that all day long. Even though it takes extra time, it's still a better option than just formula feeding, but neither is ever going to be as good as latching your baby on and breastfeeding. I know that can seem like a lot. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. I don't want you to feel like I'm shaking my finger at you, telling you you must breastfeed. I'm not telling you any of these things. I'm just giving you the facts. I'm just telling you what I have witnessed over 20 years of seeing these relationships over and over and over again, and the time commitment and what it does to the mamas and what it does to their rest and what it does to the families when they are so exhausted that they can't function because they're up all night making bottles. That's reality. So I cannot encourage you enough to nurse, 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 breastfeed, breastfeed, breastfeed. Do the prep work before the baby gets here so you know what to expect. And that's the big thing. Once your baby is here, you are tired because you just went through labor. It's hard to learn at this point. You only retain about 10% of what you hear. So even if I come in and I try to teach you about breastfeeding after your baby's here, you're only going to hear a tenth of what I have to say, or you're only going to retain a tenth of what I have to say because you're tired and you're worried about every little noise your baby makes and every little wiggle and every little grunt. And if they're crying, then you're certainly not learning anymore. Then you're getting stressed and just thinking, I've got to do something. I've got to give this baby something. And you're much quicker to give up at that point because you feel out of control and you feel helpless and you feel unprepared. And that's the key. You've got to get prepared before the baby comes. It isn't as daunting or scary as you have been led to believe when you do those steps ahead of time. And one of the best things that you can do is to take a course or read a book like Breastfeeding Made Simple, which I have available, a link available for that in my resources. I'll link that down below in the show notes. Either read Breastfeeding Made Simple or take something like my online Christian childbirth education course, because in that course we spend a whole module going deep into breastfeeding and the preparation and how it works and how to latch the baby and all these different things that you're going to need to already know by the time the baby gets here. See, that what you do is you do the preparation, you read the books, you take the classes before the baby gets here, and you've got most of the information there. And then once you start trying to latch the baby on, if you have any issues, you've already got your references to go back to refer to of, wait, when this happens, what do I need to do? And you've maybe tagged it in your book or flagged it in your book or jotted down a little note from your course. And you've got the tools in your tool belt ready to go to work through the issues and just keep on trucking and not give up. So I highly recommend, well, even if you take my course, don't take my course, that's your call. But get this book, Breastfeeding Made Simple. I read this book when I'm going to tell you right now, I was doing the opposite of what I just told you. I read it after AJ got here, but I had a lot of preparation and education about breastfeeding. So I was actually reading this while I was nursing AJ, my oldest, and I learned so much in this book that I didn't already know, despite the fact that I had a whole lot of experience under my belt by that point. And that tells you that even with all the experience I had as a professional, this book still had good things, good little nuggets of information to carry away. It's all flagged up and highlighted and everything on mine. And I've bought lots of these and given away. And this is my one of my biggest giveaway books. And I'll say that if you're anywhere near a McKay's, the used bookstore, I've gotten several of these for $1 at McKay's, and anytime they have them, I grab them all up and save them until I have another friend that needs them. So that's how much I believe in that book. And the link again will be down in the description. But I would also encourage you to consider taking my class, not because my class is the only way to learn, but my class does have a very strong focus on the Lord and knowing that His design is best. And I teach you how to work with His design. And that's the kicker. That's the key that a lot of programs leave out. The whole, oh yeah, God designed this. It works best when we work with it. And that's really what I pour over and over and over again to try to get you to remember the faith that I know that you have and get it to cross over so that you get closer to God during this process. You grow closer to Him, your relationship grows stronger while your relationship with your baby grows stronger because you're giving your baby the best and you're getting that sweet, special time that breastfeeding brings where you are just looking at your sweet baby and gazing into his eyes or her eyes, and they're looking back at you. It's really one of the best times of motherhood, is those early nursing times. Are they hard? Yes. Is it a lot to work through when you're new to it? Yes. But is it worth it? Absolutely. And I hope that this episode has helped you to see that. And I'm going to see you right back here next week. Real quick, if today's episode blessed you in any way, would you head over to Apple Podcasts and leave me a quick 5-star written review? It'll take you less than a minute, but it's the best thank you you can give me. and it will help my show to reach more mamas just like you, so we can all find God's best for our families. I'll see you right back here in a few days.